Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission, like always, is to grab some really interesting source material, research articles, things you've sent in, and basically pull out the key stuff, the surprising bits, the things that really help you get your head around a topic.
And today we're tackling something pretty heavy, honestly. It's the whole dynamic between drug cartels and the government down in Mexico. It's very complex.
It really is. And our main source today is actually a fascinating thesis out of Utah State University. It takes some really important earlier research by Guillermo Trejo and Sandra Lay and sort of builds on it. And the big puzzle we're trying to figure out is this. Why do these incredibly powerful criminal groups, who you'd think would want to, stay in the shadows.
Right, operate discreetly.
Exactly. Why do they strategically go after government officials, politicians? It just seems, well, counterintuitive on the surface.
It absolutely does. You'd imagine direct confrontation with the state or its representatives is the last thing they'd be looking for.
So that's what this deep dive is about. We'll look at the history that kind of set all this up, explore some of the theories about why this violence happens, and then really hone in on what this specific research found about why officials get targeted. And there's a really interesting potential extension to that research we'll touch on too. Let's get into it.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, so to really understand this whole puzzle about targeting officials, you kind of have to step back and look at the history, right? Starting way back, like post-1946 Mexico. The sources make it clear the country wasn't always like this, not this level of drug violence anyway. For a long time, the PRI, the ruling party, they had this sort of stability. How did that work? How did they coexist with the traffickers?
Well, it was informal, often pretty corrupt, let's be honest, but there is an understanding. The source material mentions these unwritten rules. Sometimes people call it the Decalogue. Basically, traffickers were expected to follow certain guidelines. Things like, keep the violence down, don't leave bodies in the street, stay away from schools. Also allow the government to make some token arrests now and then, generate some revenue for the community, respect each other's territory. Crucially, don't make separate deals directly with the police or judges. It sort of managed the conflict, kept things, well, predictable for decades.
It's less of a war, more like a managed, illicit but managed system.
Pretty much. But that stability, it started to fray, 60s, 70s, U.S. demand for drugs just exploded, especially stuff coming from South America, like Colombia. And then when the U.S. clamped down on routes in the Caribbean...
Pushed everything west, right, into Mexico.
Exactly. It inadvertently turned Mexico into the main corridor.
And I remember reading, Mexico really filled that vacuum in the 90s when the big Colombian players, Cali, Medellin, they got taken down or weakened. That's when the Mexican groups we hear about now, Sinaloa, Juarez, Tijuana, really started to become, well, huge.
Yeah, they transformed from sort of smaller family outfits into these massive, complex organizations. And this boom happened right as Mexico was undergoing this fundamental political shift. Democratization. The PRI started losing its grip, eventually lost the presidency in 2000 after decades.
So that must have totally messed up those old informal deals and protection rackets the PRI had going.
Oh, massively. It shattered them. And as those broke down, state institutions, especially at the local level, got weaker. The cartels reacted. They armed themselves to the teeth, formed their own paramilitary wings.
Like the Zetas, right. The source mentions them formed from military defectors.
Yes, a chilling example. They really upped the ante in terms of brutality and military tactics.
Okay, so that brings us closer to the present. 2006, President Calderon comes in and declares this full-on war on drugs.
He did. And his main approach was targeting the leaders, the so-called kingpin capture strategy. Now, it had some success elsewhere, maybe, but in Mexico. Well, it had this devastating unintended consequence. It fragmented the big cartels. Taking out the leader didn't destroy the organization. It often caused it to break into smaller, competing factions, and these smaller groups were often even more violent, fighting each other in the state. It just dramatically escalated the violence overall.
The numbers you see are just, staggering. The source mentions over 300,000 homicides since 2006.
And while, a lot of that is cartel on cartel fighting, the source is clear. They also branched out. Major increases in kidnapping, extortion, even like industrial-scale oil theft. We see the spillover now, right? Reports of violence hitting tourist spots like Cancun, Tulum. That's often about local economic control, fighting over resources.
And the human cost is immense. It always seems to hit the most vulnerable, hardest migrants, the poor. There's this quote in the material from Mexican bishops way back in '84, saying poverty pushes peasants towards drug production, and the mafias move in. often helped by corrupt officials. And migrants are incredibly vulnerable too, sometimes exploited with official complicity.
And this gets us right back to our main question. The direct targeting of people like journalists and government officials. The source notes, over 100 journalists killed since 2000? And just between 2007 and 2012, dozens of mayors, police chiefs assassinated. Why go after them directly?
It seems like it's about control, doesn't it? Controlling what gets reported, influencing policies.
That's the argument. And this kind of violence, it sparks this debate among academics. Should we call these groups narco-terrorists? Or is it more accurate to think of it as a criminal insurgency?
What's the difference there?
Well, the source suggests that while they absolutely use terror tactics, intimidation, horrific violence, they don't usually have a clear political goal or ideology like traditional terrorist groups. They aren't typically trying to, say, overthrow the national government and impose a new political system.
So criminal insurgency might fit better.
Some argue yes. That theory suggests they're trying to weaken the state's authority in specific areas to establish their own control, maybe even gain some local support or legitimacy by providing services or order where the state fails. It's like creating a parallel government almost.
And then President Obrador came in 2018 with a different approach, right? Talking about it as more of a social justice issue needing desecuritization.
Yes, shifting the frame. But the research we're looking at indicates that, so far at least, this change in rhetoric hasn't really translated into a significant drop in the overall violence levels.
And the level of violence is, well, intense.
It is. Some analyses argue it meets the technical criteria used to define a civil war. Sustained fighting between the state and these organized non-state groups, really high death tolls year after year, casualties on both sides. It's a sobering comparison.
Wow. Okay, that historical context is absolutely vital. It shows this problem didn't just appear overnight. It evolved, changed dramatically, especially after the old PRI system broke down and the war strategy kicked in.
Exactly. It's a constantly shifting landscape.
Right. So with that history laid out, let's pivot into the theories. How do researchers try to understand why this violence happens, and specifically why officials become targets?
Well, the source material lays out sort of the main theoretical buckets that studies in this field tend to draw from. One is just basic competition, right? Fighting over markets, routes. Another is access to resources, guns, fighters, money. And a third, really crucial one, is state weakness, or how the state chooses to enforce laws or not enforce them.
And the source makes a distinction, doesn't it, between just any criminal group and what they call organized criminal groups. OGCs.
Yeah.
There's a nod to Thomas Schelling.
Yeah, that's a key idea. Schelling argued that what makes OGCs different is that they don't just want to break laws. They have an ambition to govern, to carve out their own space, their own rules outside of the state's legitimate control. And that ambition, fundamentally, is what drags them into politics and conflict with the state.
So it's that desire for parallel authority that's the key differentiator.
That's the argument. And the source stresses something important. It's not just the fact that drug trafficking is illegal that causes violence. The state's reaction is a massive factor. Finding that sweet spot for enforcement is incredibly hard. Too little, they thrive. Too much, or the wrong kind, can provoke huge backlash, like we saw with the kingpin strategy.
And this ties into the idea of territory, too.
Absolutely. This concept of territoriality, wanting to control specific geographic areas, OGCs often focus on places, maybe impoverished communities, not just for drug routes or whatever, but because the state might be weaker there. It makes it easier to exert influence, maybe even offer their own twisted version of order or services.
Okay, all that theory brings us right to the core question in the Trejo and Lay research that this thesis revisits. Why do drug cartels murder government officials and party candidates in Mexico? And the source notes these specifically focused on high-profile violence because, again, it seems like it would draw unwanted attention.
Right. So they looked at four main possible explanations, or hypotheses. First was the repression hypothesis. Basically, cartels hit back at officials as retaliation when the state cracks down on them.
Simple cause and effect. The state pushes, they push back against the state's people.
Kind of, yeah. Second, the competition hypothesis. Maybe they attack officials who are seen as helping rival cartels, or they use violence to coerce future officials into helping them get an edge over competitors.
Using politics as another weapon in their turf wars. Makes sense.
Third, rent-seeking. The idea that violence is a tool to basically extort resources or rents from the state itself, maybe controlling contracts or illicit taxes to fund their own operations and conflicts.
And then the fourth one, which Trejo and Luddy really seem to lean into.
That's the criminal governance hypothesis. This argues that attacking officials, especially when there's already conflict swirling, isn't just retaliation or about competition directly. It's about a deeper goal: gaining control over the local government machinery itself, and through that, control over the people and the territory. It's fundamentally about establishing their own rule.
Okay, so that's the big idea they wanted to test with data.
That's the one. And their key measure, the dependent variable, was the likelihood of one of these high-profile attacks happening. And they defined attack pretty broadly, not just murders, but also kidnappings, public threats, assassination attempts. And it wasn't just mayors. It included other officials, candidates.
Right, a wider range of targets.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into the findings. This is where the rubber meets the road. What did replicating Trejo and Lee's analysis show about those drivers? What about turf wars?
Okay, so they used drug-related murder rates as a proxy for how intense the turf wars were. And the findings: really strong support for that first hypothesis. Attacks on officials were way more likely when and where there was intense conflict happening, both cartel versus state and cartel versus cartel.
How much more likely?
Significantly. The numbers are stark. For every extra drug-related murder per 1,000 people, the odds of an official being attacked jumped by 33.4% in one statistical model and over 54% in another version they ran.
Wow. So it's not just that violence is high around officials, it's being directed at them as part of that conflict.
Exactly. It's embedded in the broader violence. And interestingly, other factors matter too. Things like how much money a municipality had and how competitive state elections were also significantly increased the odds of attacks.
Okay, what about the next one? Vertical partisan fragmentation. That sounds complicated. How did they measure that, and what was the link?
Yeah, it sounds technical, but the idea is pretty straightforward. They used what's called the juxtaposition index. Basically, it scores how aligned or fragmented the political parties are across different levels of government, president, state governor, and the local mayor. The score ranges from 0 to 8, representing all the possible combinations of party control.
So it's like mapping.
Mm.
Is everyone from the same party, or is it a mix, like a pan president, a PRD governor, and a PRI mayor or something?
Exactly that. And the finding here was really powerful. It strongly backed their hypothesis. Attacks were much more likely when political power was divided vertically. And they found one scenario was particularly dangerous.
Which was?
States that had governors from the leftist PRD party, while the federal government was controlled by the conservative PAN party, under Calderon, for instance.
And the difference in risk was big.
Huge. Astonishing, really. Governors and mayors in those specific PRD-led states were found to be 434% and 484%, yes, over 400% more likely to be attacked than their counterparts in states governed by the president's party.
Good grief. Nearly 5 times the risk. That screams that cartels exploit political divisions, doesn't it? Does the source give a reason why that specific mix was so volatile?
It fits the theory that these politically divided or maybe neglected states lack effective coordination or maybe don't get the same level of federal support or protection. This creates a kind of power vacuum or weakness that the cartels can ruthlessly exploit.
Okay, and then election cycles. That played a role too.
A very clear role, supporting their third hypothesis. High-profile attacks spiked significantly during local election years when governorships or mayoralties were up for grabs. The odds went up by over 60% in those years.
But here's a really interesting twist. Attacks actually decreased during federal election cycles by like 44%.
Exactly, which strongly suggests that the violence aimed at officials isn't about swaying national politics or who becomes president. It's laser-focused on influencing who controls things at the local level. That's where the criminal governance goal really plays out, where they want to install compliant mayors or intimidate candidates.
Makes perfect sense if control is the goal. Okay, last one. Territorial ambition. Did the data show attacks are linked to expansion?
It did. They looked at whether attacks in one municipality were linked to attacks happening in neighboring ones. And yes, it supported their fourth hypothesis. An attack was about 41% more likely in a place if its adjacent neighbors were also experiencing attacks.
So it's not just isolated incidents. It suggests a pattern, like they're trying to secure whole corridors or regions, not just single towns.
Right. It points towards a strategy of controlling networks and expanding influence systematically. The source also mentions they did a sort of mini case study comparing Michoacan, which had that vulnerable PRD governor, with nearby states run by the president's party, like Guerrero and Guanajuato. And the qualitative evidence seemed to back up the statistical findings about how fragmentation mattered.
Okay, so summing up the Trejo and Levy findings, as replicated here. Attacking officials isn't random terror. It's strategic. It happens more when there's already conflict, when government is divided, during local election seasons, and it seems linked to controlling territory. It all comes back to that idea of criminal governance.
That's the central argument coming out of this particular line of research focusing on the violence against officials, yes.
But, and this is important, the thesis we're drawing on points out a potential limitation here. Focusing only on violence, however crucial, might not tell the whole story.
Exactly. The author makes a really thoughtful point. Violence is a key tactic, sure, but it doesn't necessarily equate to cartels' success or capture the depth of their actual presence and influence in a community.
And this leads to something the author mentions personally experiencing talking to people in Mexico, who sometimes said they trusted the local cartel more than the government. Maybe the cartel opened a cheap restaurant, or provided some basic service, or imposed a kind of order where the state was totally absent or just corrupt.
Right. It's a disturbing idea, but it highlights that cartel power isn't always just about fear. Sometimes it taps into state failure, offering a kind of perverse alternative, a form of social control, or even perceived legitimacy in certain contexts. And that realization was a key motivator for the extension proposed in the thesis.
Which involves bringing in another data set, right? The Mapping Criminal Organizations, or MCO, data set.
Yeah, the MCO data tries to measure something different. Not just incidents of violence, but the overall intensity of a cartel's presence in a place, rating it as minor, significant, or major based on lots of different sources. The thesis author suggests this could be a useful proxy for cartel success, or how deeply embedded they are beyond just counting attacks.
So the new research question becomes,
Basically, does the level of government unity or fragmentation using that same juxtaposition index affect the level of cartel presence and threat as measured by those MCO intensity ratings?
and the hypothesis would be,
That more unified governments where the president, governor, and mayor are aligned will tend to have lower levels of intense cartel presence compared to politically fragmented areas.
why is that extension potentially important?
Because, as the author argues, figuring out what allows cartels to establish deep presence and succeed in governing spaces, not just what triggers violence, is absolutely critical if you want to design policies that actually work. It's about strengthening the state's own legitimacy and connection with communities.
Yeah, because if cartels are filling gaps left by the state, whether it's security or basic services, just fighting the violence won't fix the underlying problem that allows them to gain that influence in the first place.
Exactly. It's about looking beneath the surface of the conflict at the conditions that actually enable criminal governance to take root.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. What we've seen is that cartel violence against officials in Mexico, it's not just random mayhem. It appears highly strategic, linked directly to ongoing conflicts, exploiting political divisions, timed around local elections, and seemingly aimed at controlling territory, all pointing towards that goal of criminal governance.
And critically, this push to look beyond just the violence, to examine how government unity might affect the actual presence and intensity of cartel control, could open up really important new avenues for understanding how these groups operate and consolidate power.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to chew on. If political disunity, that fragmentation between federal, state, and local governments, is a major factor allowing cartels to not just commit violence, but actually establish a deeper presence and influence, what does that really imply about the kinds of solutions needed? Is focusing heavily on military crackdowns potentially missing the bigger picture of needing to build state capacity, political cohesion, and ultimately trust between the government and the communities it's supposed to serve, especially in those vulnerable areas?
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into some really challenging but important research.